Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Some of you know that I've been under the weather. I had a bad relapse last night, so I'm on a bit of a vision quest with a veritable pharmacopoeia of chemicals inside of me and lots of caffeine. But what's really keeping me going is my unbridled enthusiasm to have my friend Francis Dearnley back on the podcast. He is one of the fan favorites. Many of you know him from the Ukraine the Latest podcast, which I've been a relentless promoter of, where he's one of the regular staple hosts. He's some sort of fancy executive editor over there now because he does stuff with sound and words and whatever. The real money is doing stuff with smell, but it's very hard to get those jobs. So I've been meaning to ask you this for a while. I can't believe I didn't ask you when we last saw each other in person. There's that famous joke that, I think was popularized by Yes Prime Minister, but it goes back way earlier. How you distinguish the different newspapers in the UK. I was looking for the joke, and I thought it was funny how Wikipedia says that the Telegraph is far right, but the Guardian is center left. And it seemed to me that you guys, maybe it's just because you mirror some of my sympathies, but like you seem closer to center right than the Guardian seems to center left. I was just wondering, can you describe how, for an American visiting London for the first time and they see all those wonderful newspaper racks in the lobby of a nice hotel, how you think they should interpret the positions of the different newspapers?
Gosh, it's a great question. A complicated one for a first, if I may say, Jonah. But it's a pleasure to be back.
And you have your own biases, and you're carrying water for all sorts of things because you work for the Telegraph. I understand, but like I know you're the kind of guy who can answer this question. So,
well, no, I'm very happy to give it a go. I mean, I certainly would question the wise wizards of Wikipedia on that classification of the Daily Telegraph being far right. I mean, so much consideration at the moment in all right-wing media, I would say, is what classifies as far right or versus populist politics. And indeed, that's a debate that is ongoing, certainly in the Telegraph newspaper, as I know it is in many others. I would certainly say that the Telegraph is an establishment newspaper in Britain, and the classic centre-right one, I would say, in terms of the opinion of the Conservative Party. Traditionally, the Conservative Party voter bloc. The Times newspaper also offering another version of that, although, again, traditionally, the Telegraph was perceived as being more rural, whereas the Times would be more urban in terms of the centre-right. So it's a complicated picture, although I would say that there is a bit of a myth in Britain that the paper of record is the Times, but in fact it's more sophisticated than that. So in a time of an absolute majority in the House of Commons for the Conservatives, it is the Telegraph that assumes the official mantle of being the paper of record, and the Times is then superseded for all other circumstances. The Guardian, I would say, would be considered, yes, a degree between centre-left and far-left, depending on the issue. I mean, the interesting history of the Guardian is that it has a very unique place also in British political life, having been born in the north of England, which was always more politically febrile, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, and really made its name in its reporting of the Peterloo massacre, which was an incident where British soldiers charged on a crowd that were protesting, and this was the birth of sort of popular movements, democratic movements that ultimately succeeded in the Victorian period, albeit through the parliamentary prism. So it's an interesting history, more complex. But then there are also nuances in there, which is that the Guardian supported the Confederacy in the American Civil War. So, as with all things, there's never one.
On what grounds?
Basically because it was impacting the cotton trade so negatively, the war. And the Confederacy was buying a lot of goods from the north of England in order to keep themselves in the fight, and of course even before the war as well. And so they were seen as being closely aligned, shall we say. But it's had a huge effect here in terms of the debates around slavery and anti-colonialism, because the great paper that's pushing for this itself was once a supporter of the Confederacy, whereas most of the British political class were, as I'm sure your listeners know more than Brits would, were very, very sceptical about supporting of the Confederacy and wanted to stay out of the American Civil War until pretty late on, when it was obvious that the Union was going to win.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are any really good reasons to support the Confederacy, but there are worse reasons and better reasons. The Guardian's reason was not particularly close to the top of good reasons for supporting it.
Fundamentally, it's self-interest and about the idea of solidarity for a certain group of people who were economically mobilized, as it were.
But then, so like was it the Mirror that was historically sort of populist right?
Yes.
Or is it...
yeah. So the Express is populist right, and the Mirror is populist left.
And did Mosley own the Express, or write for the Express, or did they support
I have to be honest,
Mosley?
My knowledge of who owned what at various different times is ropey. But of course,
that's fair. And when you asked for what we wanted to talk about, I didn't mention any of this, so I apologize.
I need to look up the exact histories of all of the different newspapers. But
fair enough.
Ownership of newspapers is a fascinating subject in and of itself.
Yeah. All right. So. The Labour Party, when last we talked, I think you had a prime minister that people were gauging against a head of lettuce to see who would last longer. And
she lost.
Since then, she lost. The lettuce was triumphant, and since then, the Labour Party had, historic is a word that is in the eye of the beholder, but a significant victory, the first victory in a long time. And took back the government, and there were a lot of high hopes. And I think Keir Starmer has very important hair, who's the head of the Labour Party, but it does not seem like things are going great. How is it going for the Labour Party, and where have they gone wrong? It sounds like this budget that they proposed pleased nobody.
Well, if one looks at the opinion polls, it's a pretty disastrous picture for Keir Starmer. I think he's got the worst ratings of a new prime minister in British history, or since records began. So it's a terrible picture for him. I think, in part, it's not entirely the performance of the Labour Party's fault, because, in a sense, they were voted in power not with an impassioned belief in the left-wing cause after such a long period of Conservative rule here in Britain, but rather because the Conservatives were seen as failure and they wanted change. But in fact, as it's been proven, the Labour Party has not really been able to deliver much of that. And so, in a sense, the popularity of Keir Starmer was only ever skin deep, and as a consequence of that, he's finding very, very quickly that people are turning against him. It's unlike Tony Blair, who was genuinely voted with a massive landslide and a lot of personal popularity that people had bought into over an extended period of time. Whereas Keir Starmer, I think, was elected for the simple reason that he wasn't the Conservative Party, he wasn't the Conservative Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak, who at the end of the day was coming in at the end of a party that was on its way out, the natural cycle of politics. But I wish to question this narrative, I think, Jonah, which I imagine is perhaps, if not popular on the other side of the pond, is more easily believed, which is that whilst the rest of the Western world is heading right, Britain has sharply turned left. As I say, I think that is very oversimplistic. It's just the electoral timetables, which is that people are anti the political elites at the moment. They were anti one, they voted those out, and now they're turning against the other form of that. And I think what really is going to be very interesting is what happens in the next electoral event, which in theory is 5 years away, when I think many people would expect there to be a populist right that is really on the on the ascendancy, led, of course, by Nigel Farage, who will be well familiar to many of your listeners because of his association with Donald Trump. But this is now his moment, because he has vast popularity amongst the traditional working class who support the Labour Party and did come out to support Keir Starmer in this election, but also many of the issues that he's championed, such as Brexit and immigration, are issues particularly keenly felt on the right. So there is a real opportunity here for the Reform Party, which he leads, to succeed and make a major breakthrough. And there's even some speculation that he might be able to overtake the Conservative Party, which really would be an extraordinary event in British political history. It tends to happen once a century that the conventional party is overtaken. The Liberal Party was destroyed by the Labour Party in the 1920s. And so we might see, again, a century later, but it being the Reform Party that overtakes the Conservatives. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but the fact is there are many people who are talking about it as a prospect now, and that is in itself an amazing turn of events.
So the Reform Party, I've met Nigel Farage a few times. One time I wasn't physically in the same room, but because Fox News was going through its sex scandal stuff, and they had announced that everyone had to take these re-education camps about sensitivity training kind of thing. And I did mine by Zoom because it was the middle of COVID, and in the middle of it, they're told mandatory compliance. Farage came in late, and they kicked him out. And that's like one of the only things I remember about that entire class, which was stupid, but I always think about that. So the Reform Party, is there a there, or is it a constellation of populist mental gestures, sort of, the same spirit of Brexit, anti-immigration, but not really a positive agenda? Or is there some sort of actual governing philosophy that is discernible to it? Because I haven't seen much that looks like one, but I also haven't studied it too closely.
Well, I think it's a new party and a new movement, which is still identifying what its core policies would be. They did have a manifesto in the last general election, which was big on many of those issues, immigration, I think, being a lead one, and indeed the Brexit idea that it's not been the great success that it could have been were it not handled better, which I believe actually many people would subscribe to that view who are on the right, that if it had been conducted in a slightly different manner, that we might be in a very different place. So I do think it is an evolving movement, but at the same time, I think it is a one-man movement, or at least that's the danger for it, because if Nigel Farage fails, then I don't really see at the moment an obvious person that would be able to succeed him and have any degree of the popularity that he has in this country. I mean, Nigel Farage is a hugely important political figure, the most important political figure probably of my lifetime, which is extraordinary when one considers that he was not in the House of Commons until this latest election. So he's only now in the House of Commons, and yet has totally transformed British politics in terms of triggering the Brexit referendum, because of the political establishment was so fearful of him. So I think in that sense, he echoes a lot of Trump, and that the relationship is quite natural as a consequence of that. He has ridden the wave of populist frustration, and indeed the way in which the mediums have transformed politics in terms of social media and everything else. I once had lunch with him, and he candidly said there that Brexit would never have happened were it not for Twitter and for social media, because it gave a huge opportunity, a democratic outlet for frustrations that many people felt but could not be articulated in the conventional House of Commons. And eventually, it did give birth, it lit the embers of that movement that eventually grew into something much, much larger. And I do sometimes think that we do tend to talk about social media as being a separate entity from media. But I think actually, and I say this as somebody on the inside, I do think that actually it's just media now. I think social media is dead. I think we actually have now entered the stage. I think if that was ever in doubt, I think Donald Trump's second victory has cemented that. I mean, if I can talk about the British example, it's been fascinating the way in which Elon Musk posts several tweets on X, as it is now, about the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, calling him two-tier Keir, very critical around the Rochester grooming scandal. And it makes headline news for days here.
Yeah.
This is media now. It is not a fringe identity. And I think that many politicians in Britain are incredibly slow to adapt to that fact. And I think most of them don't understand it. They think they just need to post the occasional picture on there of them doing good deeds in the constituency. The fact is that the real political movements of the future, and indeed of the present, are going to be those that can combine the way in which Donald Trump and others have mobilized that feeling en masse, and be able to channel it into other political avenues, which I think are different in the conventional forms that they've taken in previous decades.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me. I think you're probably right. I don't necessarily think it's a positive thing.
No, neither do I, by the way, I should say. But
Yeah, I mean, there were all sorts of problems with the broadcast era, but the word broadcast implies a broad audience where you're going to have diverse people, diverse views, getting the same access to the same information, and so much of our media climate now is competing narrowcast audiences where people are working from completely separate sets of facts, epistemologies, and they're told that if you're not hearing it from us, it's not true. And sometimes that's accurate, and sometimes it's completely false. But I think it's a mess. On the
on that
Rotherham
point, Jane,
thing,
right,
yeah,
I sometimes wonder, the famous series by Eric Hobsbawm, the book, the famous Marxist historian, but actually his books are often considered classics of summaries, and he summarized ages into single words. So there's the age of revolution for the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, the age of capital, the age of empire, and then the age of extremes for what he calls the short 20th century, which I think he has as from 1914 to 1991. And I often
yeah,
wonder what his new word would be if he was still alive. And I think age of fragmentation might be one of them, or something akin to that, because to your point, we are seeing on so many different forms the people becoming siloed away from each other and thinking that single narratives are the only narratives, or that area for compromise is becoming narrower and narrower as a product of the media. And yet at the same time, it's very difficult to criticize, I think, if you're a Democrat. And that's the challenge, because in a sense, you're having to admit that earlier mediums of knowledge were elitist in
mm-hmm.
their composition, in the editorial stance that was taken. And now we are in a more democratic age. And if you believe in the principles of democracy and everybody having a right to speak, then I think it's very difficult to criticize that. I think there are grounds in which one can criticize the idea of there being no curation, there being no editorial oversight. But it's a hard case to make when you've had decades of so-called experts, so-called elites, making so many catastrophic errors. I mean, I always feel that in democratic societies, we can attack the leaders and that have risen in recent years, but they are products of failure. And if the
Yeah.
experts have got more big calls right, then we might not be in this scenario at all.
Yeah. So I mean, if we're going to do the political philosophy stuff here, I don't know if this is something that resonates in the English or the British context, but there's a kind of a niche debate in my world about the difference between democracy and small r republicanism. And it gets very confusing because in Europe, basically the small r Republicans were almost always, not always, but almost always the Democrats, right? It was the republicanism was the alternative to monarchy. And republicanism could take a lot of different forms. And it's not really until the revolutions of 1848 where the Republicans become basically the bourgeois moderate middle, and then the radical, Communist Manifesto comes out in 1848, and then you have this sort of the children of Babeuf, the Republicans of the French Revolution, who are socialists. And this is where Hayek talks about how the classical liberalism used to be the transgressive rebellious movement, and then it got outflanked by the socialist left and became the force of reaction and privilege and elitism. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is I'm a believer in the American context has nothing to do with the Republican Party, small r republicanism, in the sense that you want your institutions to have democratic accountability, but also democratic responsibility, and that means that they're going to be run by people who have the greater good in mind. And if that sounds elitist, I don't give a rat's ass. The problem is everyone else does, so I lose these arguments, right? But like, you want the head of your university to take into account the views of the students and the faculty and the alumni and other stakeholders, but not be utterly beholden to them. In political science about Congress in the U.S., the two famous models are the trustee model and the representative model. And the trustee model is sort of like Burke in the Letters to the Elder of Bristol, right? Where he says, I owe you my wisdom and my counsel, but not my blind obedience. Or I'm bangling it, but that's
He then lost the election, by the way.
Fair enough, but like a good reason to lose it. And the representative model, which just basically says, I give you a proxy to do exactly what your constituents want and nothing else. I think that model is bad for society. Obviously, there's going to be overlap. There are going to be times when you have to do what your constituents want, because that's why you were elected to a certain extent. But there are going to be other times where your better judgment is going to say, this is not the best way to do it. And we need to figure out a language in our politics on both sides of the pond that buttresses this idea. And what's ironic to me is I think everybody intuitively understands it. They just don't want a responsible leader from any other party other than their own. Because Donald Trump says all the time, I have to make these tough decisions. I have to do things that people aren't going to like, but we need to do it. And his biggest followers love it. And the people who don't like what he's going to do hate it. I think you can find a more responsible statesman who could make those arguments in ways that don't alienate the people who disagree with you, but that takes a level of political sophistication and a non-populist moment in politics, and we're still in a crazy populist moment.
I mean, I think that it's quite interesting reflecting what you've just been saying there on the perspective of Donald Trump from a British angle, because it depends on who one asks, of course. But I think many in educated circles continue to roll their eyes at what's going on. But among more ordinary people, I think there's more of a begrudging respect for Trump this time round. Circumstances have changed, and there's more of an appetite for strong men who come along, pledge to act, and are actually able to do so. I mean, the events around Colombia this week, the threat and then it leading to action, that from a British perspective will be considered nothing short of miraculous. A politician who says they're going to do something when somebody tries to stop them, threatens them, and they back down. I mean, this is a popular thing in many European countries at the moment, because the structure of our societies have been proven to be an impediment for progress and radical change at times when, of course, the technology, the media, all of these things we were just talking about have accelerated many things, and societies have just not been able to keep up with that, at least as far as people feel that their own sense of progression has matched it. So I was thinking about this the other day, that is there not a part of Gen Z who, in a sense, want to see their own prosperity mirrored in the speed in which their phones improve? Yet the fact is that they're not seeing that. And I think one of the most interesting phenomena that we're seeing on both sides of the pond is the number of young people who are being very attracted to that strong men idea. It is always typically men. Of course, I'm appealing to the great man of history idea here, but I think it isn't really necessarily dependent on that. Rather, it's just they want people who say they're going to do things, and things happen. And I think the lesson that has come out of the last few years, whether it be around Brexit, whether it be around attempting to reform the National Health Service here in Britain, which Keir Starmer is trying to do, is that you can pull the lever and nothing happens. And in a democratic society, that is not tenable forever. And that is why, of course, we look to the United States and a man like Trump who can just pass these executive orders, and it becomes a more attractive proposition. Of course, the problem is that our systems aren't geared to be able to do that. Deliberately, there are systems in place that make it very difficult to conduct radical change, even if you've got a very, very strong majority, because of the legal apparatus that is in place. And my fear is that, in a sense, we're going through this process at the moment of people seeing that one type of governance has failed, one elite has failed. They're trying a new sort of liberal left-wing elite now. That won't succeed. All the time, issues are bubbling beneath the surface around growth, around immigration. And eventually they try something much, much more radical. And that appeal will, of course, increase if they look across the pond and see, well, Donald Trump was able to do this and do that, and it wasn't so bad after all. But, of course, yours is a different system with a different political history. And as we've seen in Europe over the centuries, things tend to take a rather darker turn here because the checks and balances don't tend to be as strong. I'm not saying necessarily in Britain, but I think that's the danger in other European countries.
So let me poke at this with the stick for a second, because one of my great peeves about the way American politics has worked for the last quarter century is that both parties have largely convinced themselves and convinced their voters that we have a parliamentary system. And you'll have people campaign for president and say, on day one, I'm going to do all of these things. And most of the things that they're talking about doing, they cannot do. I remember in 2020, when she was still in the primaries, Kamala Harris said, on day one, we're going to get the guns and get rid of Trump's tax cuts and all that. And there's nothing in the Constitution that would possibly allow such a thing. But then you get the expectation, because you've told your voters that you can do such things, and then they get into office and they can't do them, or what they do is they issue these executive orders, which are not nearly as powerful or as binding or as lasting as actual legislation from Congress. And so Trump, some of these executive orders are very significant because they will be politically difficult to repeal. And so I don't want to take that away. But for the most part, what you can do by executive order can be undone by executive order when the next guy comes in. And meanwhile, in the UK, I remember Paul Begala telling me, he's a political consultant here, who he was saying he was doing consulting work for the Blair team, 20 years ago. And after they won, he said, this old cliche in American politics, okay, that was the easy part. Now comes the hard part, governing. And Blair apparently said, well, that's not actually how our system works, because once you control Parliament, you control the government. And you can do a lot of things with a simple piece of legislation from an institution that you have a majority in that you couldn't possibly do in the American political system. And yet I hear from you and I hear from lots of other people that the blob, as some people might call it, the deep state, as some people might call it, prevents prime ministers from getting anything done. Is it all because you guys were just so lazy and refused to write down your constitution? I mean, what is is it public choice theory that explains it? What is the reason why you can't get stuff done in your country that it's pretty clear there's a political will to see gotten done?
Well, if you were asking many people on the right that question, they would answer that, and let's say you asked this question 10 years ago, they would say that a major, major barrier for change is the European Union and our membership on it, because of the various laws that had become our laws by default, which meant that if Parliament tried to pass a vote that broke those laws or went against them, that then there would be courts who would decide that actually that was an illegitimate vote in the British Parliament, and thereby, as a consequence, the law would be voided. You can see why people got so upset around the sovereignty arguments, given that reality. And so that was one very, very strong argument that was made. What we've seen since that, of course, because we're now out of the European Union, is that many of those laws are still on the books, and many lawyers are able to point at them and still stop the government from doing certain things that would be considered rather more radical than the status quo. And this is a new battleground for British history, because quite a lot of the legal issues that prime ministers have faced were the products of creating an independent judiciary outside of Parliament, which Tony Blair did. So again, if we're looking at what the right would say in response to that question, they would say, well, you need to dismantle the reforms that Blair passed less than 25 years ago, which led to there always being another block of power that subverts Parliament. And even Tony Blair admitted that he went too far in some of the reforms that he made to what is called softly, but rather inaccurately, the British Constitution. Because you're right, in theory, Parliament should be able to vote. If you're looking at this historically, Parliament should be able to vote, and with the royal assent signed by the sovereign, almost anything is possible. But in the last 30 years, we've seen that there have been so many different barriers to progress that have been erected that it's actually very difficult to make major change without there then being major challenges in the courts. Now, in theory, and this is again another critique that's been made by some, you could just pass lots and lots of laws in Parliament that basically voids those laws that are being used and weaponized against you. But it's a tricky thing. You imagine you've got so many law books. I know lawyers, I used to live with them at university, so I say this with love to a degree, but they would admit, that the law is a very, very complicated thing, and it's been built up over a very, very sustained period of time here in this country. And it means that this stuff gets bogged down. It takes years. And there are certain ongoing law cases even now, which mean that it's an obstruction to progress. But I go back to the point that I made earlier on, which is this is all complicated detail, but try selling this and explaining this to an ordinary democratic voter, which is basically saying, hey, look, you voted for this, but you can't do it because, well, it used to be because of the EU, but now actually it's because of the justice system in Britain, and we need to pass all of these complicated laws, so it takes time. People just say, just get it done. Get it done. Yeah. And if somebody comes along who says, I will, even if they can't necessarily, at least not immediately, that is a very, very attractive message. And the danger is that, people do start coming along and saying, I'm willing to throw the baby out of the bath with the bathwater here. I'm willing to try and really break down the conventions of the British state in order to try and get stuff done. We're not there yet, but I think that's the danger, because I think it is untenable in a democratic society for, in times of great change, great unrest about many, many issues, for basically people to say there's nothing that one can do to solve this. And that's before you even get into the issues around what politicians would say is politically possible, because they would say, well, you can't stop immigration because it would tear the economy apart overnight. And so they're not even willing to engage with that prospect of discussion, which again I would say is untenable in a society that tends to be that claims to be democratic. So it's not the crown that's the barrier. That was always the danger in British history for such an extended period of time, is what if the king, what if the queen is opposed to this, or indeed the House of Lords, until the act in 1911 that meant that the House of Commons could always pass laws despite objections in the House of Lords. But there are different obstacles now, and it's trying to navigate those, which I think will be the great challenge for leaders coming after this latest cycle. And if they can't solve them, then we're in a very, very difficult situation indeed. And just one final thought on this. I was reading Isaiah Berlin's reflections on great men of history, just to revert back to that point. And he said there are two types of great figures. There are those who have sort of the conviction of their principles and just cut through the tape and get things done. The Theodore Roosevelts or whomever. You can think of so many examples of that. But there is another type, and it's those who are able to, in a sense, understand the complexities of the system, inch it forward slowly towards their overarching objective until their victory eventually is so deep and so profound that they wake up and suddenly realize it's too late to challenge that. I think Abraham Lincoln would be an example of a leader who was able to do that. But
Isn't
question,
that sort of Disraeli muddling through, right? Of
exactly,
like incremental.
But
Yeah.
my question to you and your listeners would be, is that with all of the stresses and strains of the system and frustrations at the moment, are you going to be able to produce figures who can achieve that rather than just those who are populist table bangers? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I am not so sure either. I mean, eventually, I think so, but because both of our countries do a pretty good job of, when it's really necessary, producing the kind of leaders that it needs. Getting back to the Democratic versus Republican thing, I think the key distinction is serious and admirable, responsible leaders tell the public that things can be done, but it will be difficult. Irresponsible leaders tell the public it would be so easy, but these nefarious, unseen forces, millionaires and billionaires, the Jews, the globalists, whoever, are preventing us from doing it. And if we could just get rid of them, it would be so easy. As Bart Simpson says when he runs for class president, my opponent says there are no easy answers. I say he's not looking hard enough, right? And you have everyone from like Bernie Sanders, who literally says you could pay for the Green New Deal and Medicare for all and socialized medicine and all of these things if millionaires and billionaires just paid their fair share. And so they're the only obstacle. And first of all, as a matter of just, maybe it's because my last name is Goldberg, whenever you identify a specific class of people and say you could live in utopia, but for the existence of those people, you got a problem, right? Yeah, you need to revisit your priors. But second of all, you could literally confiscate all of the wealth of the top 1% in America, and it would not pay for the wish lists of the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders. Wouldn't come close. And meanwhile, the moral hazard of confiscating wealth would ground the economy to a halt. People would hide their assets. Wealth confiscation doesn't do well for an economy. And I think that's my problem with Farage. I probably agree with him on a bunch of specific issues, depending on what beer hall he's talking. That's unfair. Depending on what audience he's talking to. But and I agree with a lot of the stuff that Trump says. But there is this. I don't like using the phrase paranoid style because it's a loaded term in the intellectual discourse in the States because of the way it's been deployed. But there is this scapegoating style of American politics that says we know exactly what to do. We know exactly how to do it. It would be easy to do it, but those people are in our way. And the true answer is there are people in our way, but they have sincere disagreements. And this will be hard, and we need to convince them that this is important to do, and we need to put the argument to the voters and win an argument, and then proceed with all due haste. And I mean, again, World War II is not the best analogy because World War II was sui generis, but Churchill told the British people it's going to be hard. Right? He didn't say, "Oh, this is going to be a cakewalk." He says, "This is going to suck." Abraham Lincoln told the American people, this is not going to be easy. It's going to be hard, but we're going to do it. And it puts the point of Republican virtue is that it puts part of the responsibility for civic leadership on the citizens themselves. It asks for better followership. It just doesn't require leadership. And I think both our countries in part, and I think social media, your point about social media is well taken. I've become a Marshall McLuhan convert. We are telling people that nobody's the boss of them, and they should have everything they want on their timetable, and nothing should be required of them. I mean, I don't know why this comes to mind, but like, it was fascinating. You might recall there was this group of voters called Bernie Bros. They're the ones that really supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. Mm-hmm. They did a poll specifically of hardcore Bernie Sanders supporters, asking, and like, by like huge numbers, 70, 80% said college tuition should be free, healthcare should be free, all these things should be free. And then they would ask, would you agree to pay like an additional $100 a month if it would get you free healthcare and free college? And the support went from like 70 to 39, right? Like literally half of these people aren't willing to have their Marxist utopia if it costs them $100 more a month. And it shows you just how cheap the rhetoric is, that it makes people think that that's an unfair trade-off. And I think there's a lot of, that's my problem with populist rhetoric on the right and on the left, is it just tells people you're not going to be expected for any sacrifice, any hard work. It's all really easy if we can just get rid of the bad people who are standing in our way.
I think I completely I completely agree. Although the uncomfortable side of me does also think as well that human nature doesn't really change, and that this talk around responsibility, it's quite often a naive assumption more associated with the left than with the right. And I agree with you. I mean, I'm a believer in personal responsibility. I would pay the charge if it were things that I really felt were for the better of the country. I mean, many people would say that young people have suffered for the good of society over the last 20 years, which is obviously having all sorts of issues here around housing now, but for the greater good. And that's your personal responsibility as a citizen. You're not out on the streets protesting it. You accept that maybe that's for the good of the greater society. But the other side of the coin is that actually, the majority of people in the majority of cases, this idea about responsibility is really, it's quite cheap.
No, I agree, and it's a lot to ask for people who are wildly overtaxed. Yeah, no, I agree.
Exactly.
I agree. I agree. If I thought that they were spending my tax dollars better and they wanted to take more of them, I would listen to them.
It goes both ways. It goes both ways. If the perception is the government has treated you abysmally for 30 years, your patience runs really thin. Maybe that's the big change. Maybe that's the big change, is that trust in our governments has fallen off a cliff. I was reading a really interesting book recently that was saying that Whitehall, which is now one of the most criticised elements of British society. You mentioned the blob earlier. Whitehall, the blob. It's basically the civil service. Okay, it's very, very heavily criticised. For the vast majority of British history, from the Napoleonic Wars onwards until probably the 1990s, the civil service is one of the most trusted institutions, just behind the monarchy, in the country. Now, people are queuing up to attack elements of it, and it's been one of the biggest changes in the last few years. That degrading of trust is really significant in our societies, and it is having massive impacts on, to your point, Jonah, about responsibility and personal responsibility, because I want to be a responsible citizen, but if I feel that I've been taken for granted for too long, then it becomes a really a difficult bargain that one is waging, and of course that's being echoed in numerous Western societies at the moment, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a theme on this podcast. There's a great line from Nathan Glazer, who is one of these original neoconservative social scientists, and he gave this speech in 1990, 91, something like that. He was an expert on basically urban public policy, and he said, starting in the 1960s, I'm paraphrasing, but in the 1960s, urban reformers stopped trying to do the things they knew how to do and tried to do the things they didn't know how to do and that they couldn't do, right? They couldn't redistribute wealth in an equitable way. They couldn't get rid of racism. But you know what they could do? They could collect the garbage, right? They could police crime. And my view on this, I think I have an incredibly reasonable view on this, which is that I am open to any of your utopian pie-in-the-sky theories about the glorious and wonderful transformative things that the government can do. But first demonstrate to me that you're really good at like business formation, and collecting garbage and public transportation and all these kinds of things. But if you suck at that stuff, why should I think that I should trust you about taxing me more to impose nirvana when you can't do the stuff that is do your job? And I think there are a lot of people in government can't do their job. We haven't talked since then, but I went on this fantastic trip to India a couple months ago and met with a lot of government leaders. It was all Chatham House rules, so I can't talk about too much about it. But one of the things that one of my colleagues on the trip had said to me was that the difference between the sort of right-wing Modi elite and the left-wing sort of more globalist elite is that the globalist elite on the left really cares about non-gender bathrooms, and the Modi elite cares about bathrooms, right? Because India needs more bathrooms, like for public sanitation, right? To stop public defecation. And like worrying about what's going on in 4-star hotels and elite apartment complexes and office buildings about gender neutral bathrooms is not something that normal people really should care about. And it seems to me, if that's the argument, I got my disagreements with the Modi crowd, but like if that's the argument, I'm on Team Modi, 10 times out of 10, because like that's proper public service. And it just seems to me that, too many Brits got infected by too many American universities.
Yeah.
American NGOs, there's this great line from Bismarck where he says the problem with the Balkans is they produce more history than they can consume domestically. And the problem with a lot of left-wing institutions in America is they produce more sort of radical ideas than can be absorbed domestically. And because we have so many foreign exchange students, we have so many NGOs that work out of here. So many global elites have to spend their time here. They follow our media, that we've infected a lot of these people with this nonsense. And I'm not saying it's all like nonsense in every regard, but it's just like not the core function of government to transform societies. It's to like provide basic services. And I think the UK has gone deeply down that road in a way that is far more pernicious than in the US, because economic growth solves a lot of the problems that stuff creates. And you guys just have not had economic growth. And this is something that we talked about recently with the last time you were on, and when I was visiting you. And I promise I'll stop monologuing. I'm just afraid I'll pass out if I don't keep talking. And I wrote about this when I was in London. This conversation that we had about how one of the biggest problems the UK has is it just doesn't have a second city.
Yes.
Right. It's like London is such an important city. And my God, I grew up in New York. I go back to New York all the time. New York is expensive. It cannot hold a candle to how expensive London is. Admittedly, I was in mostly tourist London, which is more expensive, but my God. And the bottleneck that London creates sociologically and economically, where young people, if they want to be the top of their career, they have to live there, and they can't afford to live there. It just seems like fairly obvious to me that is such low-hanging fruit for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party to just simply say, what we're going to try and do is create more regional hubs for economic growth. Germany, you're the one who pointed out to me that Germany has different cities for different industries and stuff like that. America probably has, and I went and looked, the median income for Manchester, which is arguably the second richest city, something like that, in England, would put it 310th or something on the list of, it's like some obscure town in Texas, like Brownsville, Texas. That's unsustainable for a great nation. And that seems to be the kind of thing that you can get political willpower.
I agree to your point that we're all on campus now, and it's been one of the most damaging effects on Western societies across the board. But I think on this issue, you're absolutely right that this is a key issue in the political discourse at the moment in the last few years, because there was all this idea about levelling up. So, as it were, moving outside of London and encouraging and promoting prosperity across the entire country. It's a noble aim. And, also it's not impossible. If one looks at the Victorian period, then there were cities that mattered much more outside of London, Manchester being one of them, Birmingham being another. These were industrial cities that essentially were producing the steel, the iron, the cotton for the rest of the world for a strong part of the 19th century. And so they really, really mattered. But Britain has never been able to forge another strong economic identity since then. And really, you're battling about against 1,000 years of British history in many ways when you talk about levelling up. Because the real challenge for Britain historically, if you're going over the broad stroke of British history, was how do you keep this kingdom together? How does one have Scotland as part of a union? How does one have Wales as part of a union? How does one have Ireland and then Northern Ireland as part of this union? And how does one keep the North, the East, the South, the West, with all their diverse differences and political opinions, even languages, if one's really going far back? So creating a unitary state was the key challenge. I imagine that some of your listeners will be familiar with the fact that the BBC's just released the latest adaptation of the Thomas Cromwell novels by Hilary Mantel, the Tudor series Wolf Hall. And what's very interesting about that period, and I've studied the Tudors a little bit in detail at various different times, is, they are constantly in fear in London that the north of England will be in open revolt, that the east of England will be in open revolt. Where I'm from, East Anglia, the sleepiest part of Britain that one can imagine in the modern world, this was a hotbed of rebellion. The village where I grew up was where Kett's Rebellion began. I bet this is the first time that Kett's Rebellion has been spoken about on such a noteworthy American podcast, so I'm proud to do that. But tiny in the grand scheme of things. But this was a threat to the crown. So for centuries, the challenge was, how do you create a unified state that keeps Scotland as part of it without the French provoking trouble? And how do you even keep this entity together? It found a solution eventually, the Napoleonic Wars being a critical element of that, which was the centralization, finally, of this state. And now it's all about devolution and all about leveling up and trying to decentralize. But the challenge of that is you're battling uphill. And really, in the age that we're living in, it's quite difficult to see why one would leave London when everything is here, and how you incentivize that. The BBC has tried, the British Broadcasting Corporation has tried to open offices in Manchester, in Bristol, in other parts of the country, but it's a hard sell for a lot of people to move. And what's happened even in places like Bristol, which is in the west of England, is that you've had a similar property price boom as took place in London, and it's unaffordable for those professionals who are being incentivized to move there, just as it was the chronic issue around house building is really a huge barrier to progression in Britain. And it's now one of the number one issues that is really in some ways proving irreconcilable, because you imagine, you've got a country that doesn't want to expand because for years, when it did try to build new houses on villages, on towns, it did it so poorly. Infrastructure wasn't provided. The beauty of the buildings constructed was much below par. The quality of the buildings themselves were substandard. So people are naturally, we call them NIMBYs, people are naturally not in my backyard, but for good reason. Right? It's this democratic argument again. We shouldn't be angry at them when you did such a poor job for decades of convincing people as to why house building was a good thing. And I think there were ways in which you could incentivize growth and house building better, but we failed. So the consequence of that is that, we just cannot get people to agree to the principle of house building, which blocks the entire economy and has major ramifications on the social cohesion of the entire state. And it's why I'm afraid I do think that the next big issue coming down the line in the next few years will be brain drain in Britain. So rather it being brain drain from the perspective of the regions lose their best and they all go to London, it will be the brain drain from the country itself going to the United States and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it's already beginning to start with regard to universities, people just choosing to go to Ivy League universities in the United States despite the exorbitant cost. And I think it's going to happen on a much larger scale. And of course, that will have huge ramifications for British society.
Well, if you have any friends who are applying to colleges, I would advise them, don't go to the Ivy League. There are a lot of better places to send your kids these days. But no, I mean, there is a small C conservative problem with our NIMBYism. One of the best examples of it is school choice. Insofar as a lot of Republicans love school choice. Also, a lot of Republicans live in wealthy suburbs where somewhere between 5 and 40% of the value of their home is correlated with the quality of the school district that they're in. And when you tell people, well, your geographic proximity to a school no longer is going to be a part of the value of your home, you're asking them to take a huge cut of their most valuable asset. There's a lot of that kind of stuff going on in the States too. But I've been very negligent because I've been on something of a cold medicine infused vision quest, and we have not gotten to Ukraine. So do you have time for just a few more minutes on
Of
this
course.
stuff? And if you can tie it to sort of the perception, what you think the likely course, or what people think the likely course that Donald Trump is going to pursue. I mean, I have my own views on all that, but it feels like the war is going badly for everybody. But the fact that, Dom was making this point the other day, when you're bringing in another 30,000 North Korean troops to back up what was supposed to be a 3-day invasion, that's not a great sign, 2.5 years later or 3 years later. So just broadly speaking, what is the state of the war, and what do you think happens next?
It's a very broad question, but it is the question of the moment, I think, certainly in the European theatre. In a sense, all eyes are on Emperor Trump. And I don't use that term glibly. I speak from the European perspective on this issue. If one assesses the European position on the war, while its countries have been the biggest funder of Ukraine, it has not been able to offer a coherent defensive posture. It has not been able to articulate what victory looks like for it, or at least a sustainable peace. And in that void has been dependent on the United States to fill in terms of weapons provision and in terms of the kind of political discourse. And it's left Europe in a position where effectively it has to beg for Donald Trump to continue his largito to Ukraine, and in Ukraine's core interests it's in Europe's core interest to ensure that whatever is settled in Ukraine is in its own security interests. And I think I'll get to negotiations in a moment, but one of the most interesting things is going to be what happens if one can imagine that Trump and Putin try to strike a deal over the heads of the Europeans and perhaps even over the heads of the Ukrainians. What happens if the deal on the table is not tenable for Europe? What if
Right.
it can't accept that? So you'll be in a position where Europe has not been able to have its own coherent defense posture. It's not been able to arm appropriately so that it has to be taken seriously. And then it's saying, we can't accept this. When I put this to notable individuals, they sort of stare at me blankly, which I always think is a rather worrying sign, because it would suggest that people are really just basically dependent on the idea that these negotiations, if they happen, are going to go well. But I think there's a lot of evidence that they might not. So you say that both sides, it's not going well. I think that's true. I think the perception from the Russians is that they can continue fighting this war at this level for a few more months, if indeed there is not a stranglehold put on them by the United States economically or in terms of weapons support. And for that reason alone, I think they will wait and see. They will continue waging this war, which is now the bloodiest since the Second World War on European soil, almost 1 million casualties for the Russians, if the numbers are to be believed. But they will keep pushing, I believe, unless they are made to feel that it's only going to get worse for them. So in that situation, it will be Europe hoping that Russia wants to talk, but actually doesn't, and then we're in a bit of a messy situation. The more positive perspective is that we enter a period of negotiations. The Ukrainians have positioned themselves quite well because Donald Trump believes that the Ukrainians want a deal, that President Zelensky wants a deal. And at the moment, given the statements, the press releases, the remarks that he has made in the past week or so since the inauguration, that he believes that Putin doesn't want to make a deal and is threatening him with economic constrictions and further sanctions. That is vital, because he thinks that the way to end the war, the way to get positive conclusions to the negotiations, is by squeezing Russia harder rather than squeezing Ukraine harder. Then that's a very, very big deal indeed. And the great open question before the inauguration was, which side was he going to fall in believing that they were the obstacles to peace? Was it the Ukrainians or was it the Russians? It would seem for now that it is the Russians, and that will have major ramifications moving forward. But it's still an open question as to quite how far he would be willing to go in order to try and throttle the Russians and compel them to sign some kind of negotiation. And I hear from insiders in the Trump camp that the big fear is that they don't want to have another Afghanistan withdrawal type scenario, and for that reason alone he wants a victory. Well, if that's the case, then he's going to need to arm Ukraine further, and he's going to need to put a lot of pressure on Russia. So that's the positive side. The other side is that it's not really a priority for him, and this just drags on and on and on. Or he tries to compel a peace that Europe and Ukraine can't accept, or that is just terrible for Ukraine. I mean, I'm quite struck that a lot of the conversation at the moment in Europe is about this idea of what a peaceful settlement would look like, and that would involve presumably having Western troops on the ground. But if this is what you think looks like a victory, I'd very much question that notion, because the British armed forces entirely mobilised, if required, to in some future conflict, because it's been, it's part of a post-war settlement in Ukraine. It's got troops in there to maintain order, and then war breaks out. Could not defend 10% of the Ukrainian border. Now, there's not a suggestion that Britain would be alone, but even with a coalition of European forces on Ukrainian soil, this is a huge, huge ask of European defence. And we're just not there in terms of mobilisation, in terms of political will. And yet there's so many people who just sort of assume that the pathway to peace is there. We're a few months away. I just don't see it, Jonah. I don't see it in terms of the Russians being able to concede enough to accept a peace. I don't see the Ukrainians as being willing to concede even more territory than is currently in play, and the idea that they can never, ever have Western boots on the ground or ever be part of NATO, or basically they cede their political sovereignty. And I don't also see a pathway where the Europe could be willing to sign an agreement which would basically mean that there are vast numbers of troops on the ground. So I think this has a much longer lifespan this year than many think.
Where do you come down? I mean, Putin is what, 72, something like that.
Yes.
What is your gut about what his 5-year plan is? I mean, is a settlement in Ukraine where he gets, the eastern slices that he wants and leaves troops there and keeps European troops out? Is that the second stage of the 3-part plan? The first part being 2014, where he, goes in. Do you think I don't want to sound naive. He obviously wants to reconstitute the old Soviet Empire, Russian Empire. He thinks Ukraine is part of Russia and all that kind of stuff. The question is, do you think he tries to do that before the time runs out on him if he gets the kind of deal that you're afraid he gets?
Then I think there is a huge danger that if Putin is able to sell this as a victory domestically, that this will only incentivize him to engage in even greater degrees of hybrid warfare and destabilization of Europe. And so what constitutes a victory for him is, I think, an open question. I think, in a sense, that changes over the course of the war. As long as he can sell it as some kind of major victory that has enabled him to gain territory and has deeply wounded the Ukrainians, then I think that he could, that's the minimum. But bear in mind that publicly he has never, ever disavowed his maximalist objectives for Ukraine. And it is worth reiterating what those are. The total demolition of the democratic system of Ukraine, the removal of President Zelensky from power, the seizure of vast amounts of territory, which he's never clearly articulated where he would draw the line, but certainly vastly more than he currently holds. And essentially the guarantee from the rest of Europe and the United States that Ukraine will forever remain in its sphere of influence. Now, those are extreme victory objectives. And if he's still clinging to those, as some believe that he does, then we are naive in the extreme to think that he would be willing to accept a peace that really just means that he gets to have a few regions in the east of Ukraine, 20% of Ukraine. I think in extremis, he would accept that if he thought that he was threatened at home. But I think that is not his starting point. And it's really important that people remember that that is not what he wants. That is not his objectives. And he is continuing to pursue far more extreme ones. The other word just to have about this is about the economy. The Russian economy is far more fragile, I think, than many believe. There is this idea that Russia is just this unstoppable beast that can wage war and mobilize any number of people and wage it indefinitely. If one looks historically, that's just not true. Not even the Soviet Union could do that. And this is not the Soviet Union. This is one component of the Soviet Union. It's lost many wars in the 20th century, even as part of the Soviet Union. So this idea that it is unstoppable is a myth. But also the idea that economically it can only go from strength to strength due to the war is being really tested to the extremes now. Bread and butter is more expensive in Russia, 20% by some metrics in terms of inflation.
Interest rates are crazy, right? I mean, interest rates are like 19-20% or something.
Extraordinary high rates. And I think what was very interesting about Donald Trump's remarks, and for those of us who perhaps are more slightly optimistic interpretation of what might unfold given the American position, he was very, very keen to continually emphasize that the Russian economy is fragile. And if he didn't believe that, if he did believe instead that Russia can just continue waging this war indefinitely and eventually succeed, then that would be very, very worrying for Ukraine indeed. But the fact is he does recognize, clearly advisors have spoken to him, that Russia cannot wage this level of war forever. It is a question of when it would be compelled to stop. And if it was compelled to stop and Putin thought he was seriously threatened, then I do believe that he would accept sort of far less than his overarching objectives. But the idea that he would accept anything, I think, in negotiations, that he just wants out, which you sometimes hear, I think is naive in terms of the assumptions and what we've seen from Russia in the last few years of war, that they have never tried to de-escalate, only escalate.
So when I was in London, it was right after the press conference that Donald Trump gave, where he said he would not rule out the use of force to taking back Greenland. I shouldn't say taking back. It was never ours, right? Taking Greenland, acquiring Greenland. And or he wouldn't rule out the use of force about the Panama Canal. And the BBC, from my viewing, went full BBC on all of this. And I'm of two minds. I detest this talk. I've been in favor of the peaceful acquisition of Greenland for a very long time. I do not want to go to war with a NATO ally. A big reason why we would want to have Greenland was, and why the Truman administration reached out to try and take Greenland, was obviated by the fact that Denmark joined NATO, was a founding member of NATO. And so like a big chunk of the strategic reasons for wanting it, at least as laid out at the beginning of the Cold War, don't really apply because they're a NATO ally. But at the same time, the reaction from the BBC crowd was very much like the reaction from the MSNBC crowd, is like here in the United States, is just fully taking the bait. I mean, the hook goes straight past the gullet into the belly and doing exactly what Trump wants people to do, which is freak out and all the rest. And I cannot make up my mind about where I come down on this in terms of the level of concern. Because on the one hand, there's the argument to be made that Trump is actually serious about this, and that the despots and dictators that he wants to be considered an equally strong man to, this is what they do. And he feels like territorial expansion is something that, is a mark of a really consequential president, and therefore I've got to do this. And I think that's grotesque. But I get very, very frustrated because I spent the last 25 years being told that quote unquote neocons are warmongers. And there's not a single neocon in the American context that ever talked about forcibly going to war with a NATO ally or re-seizing the Panama Canal, right? But I'm curious, in the UK, how do you guys read that stuff? Do you see it as mostly trolling, partly trolling, possibly trolling, partly serious? Is it something to be concerned about, or you just sort of, you're like the rest of us, you're so battered by all of this that you just take it day by day?
I think it depends on who you ask, Jonah. I mean, I think that many people would subscribe to the latter camp you've just described, others the former. There are many who are outraged in the British political establishment at the idea of America speaking in this way. I think it is worth bearing in mind in the context of what separates the United States from other great powers that you've just articulated, whether it be China or Russia. I mean, I actually would very much question whether Russia is a great power. Not saying you were saying that, but it's still in the public consciousness. It's still very much present as being
Russia's a sick man of Europe, but Putin presents globally and in Trump's mind as a great man, as a strong man.
Indeed. But I think that we need to try and shed that notion. I mean, it has an economy the size of Spain's. But anyway, I digress. I think that what makes America extraordinary is not its ability to project power militarily, but its allies. You know, Russia does not really have allies in the same way. It has transactional relationships with Iran. It has transactional relationships with North Korea. And one could say that also of China, that these are not allies of ideology as much as they are about profit. And I think the danger for the United States when it speaks in this way from the perception of Europe, you asked me about the perception of Europe, regardless of the legitimacy of America's own defense posture. From the perspective of Europe, there is a real danger that it loses what makes its power projection so extraordinary, which is its allies and its desire for its allies to work closely with the United States. And many in Europe look to the United States as being the core defender of Western principles, the leader of the free world, and the memory of the Second World War runs deep. They remember being liberated by American soldiers. It's a serious, serious thing. One needs to only go to anywhere in France or Belgium at the time of an anniversary of D-Day, say, as I was at last year, to see how deep that relationship runs. And when it becomes merely about not working together for the greater good, but America first, which I know is part of the American tradition. I'm not naive about this. But if you're looking at contemporary modern history, when the narrative shifts in this way, a lot of people do get upset and a lot of people do get worried. And so I don't think it's a small thing. I don't think it's something that actually people sort of roll their eyes and say, oh, he's just, speaking nonsense as usual. I think in certain countries there are very, very serious concerns about what this signals about the American position on their shifting alliances. And it comes, I suppose the point I'm trying to underscore here is it's not without risk for the United States in the long term. If it thinks it's all about just our power is because of our military might, then I would say that is not the full story. And I'm very, very critical of Europe and how it's approached its defense and its over-reliance on the United States. But Europe is still an entity of power and weight. And if it is compelled to act in a different direction that is more not hostile to the United States, but skeptical of the United States, we lose, but you lose too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On that note, because I agree with you entirely about that, Francis Dearnley, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Hope to have you back in short order when I'm not hallucinating. And it's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's a real pleasure to be here. Likewise, love to have you on Ukraine the latest again soon.